Like many North Americans, I was quite slow to give Dragon Quest the time and appreciation it deserved. When I was much younger, I saw it as something that seemed immature. And perhaps by bad luck or memorable impression, the series always seemed a bit too weird for me. Why did the game look so artistically childish, but also pervasive in seriousness? Why were the enemies so orthographically placed? Why was the devil wearing sweatpants? On top of other petty grumbles, story had been a largely important part for me, bearing through janky, cruel designs that some RPGs had. And every time I was told about the story, it seemed comically simple. Just a reason to go collect a MacGuffin from place A, then go to place B, barely with ever connection of one to the other, at least on the surface level. In comparing the retro games graphically and technologically, it always felt like other big JRPGs on the block were always just a little bit better. The graphics looked more appealing, the story had more front-loaded characters. Despite everyone praising this series to the moon and back, I couldn't understand. How could something so bare bones in its simplicity be so beloved? And then life got more complicated. In early 2021, I got married, I moved, and had to manage 3 jobs because on top of all this, the pandemic and lockdowns were in full swing, making for uncertain employment and shaky hours. A lot was going on, and I could honestly say it was one of the busiest points in my life. It came at this busyness that I suddenly had this unexplainable urge to give Dragon Quest a try. So, with the exhausted free time I had, I decided to give Dragon Quest XI a go. And I finally got it. Dragon Quest Echoes of an Elusive Age is a brilliant and vibrant fantasy adventure that is serious, silly, and beautiful all at the same time. Its systems are never overbearing, and its characters are always interesting. Despite the story never getting overly complicated, there's always a small twist to challenge your expectations and tug at your heartstrings. Playing DQ11 astounded me at how it felt so effortless from the base level to how good the game could be. The game wasn't seamless, nor was it drowning in bells and whistles, but it was so accessible that for me it fit so flawlessly into a busy schedule. This was even more so the case since the Switch version could also be taken with me, and I could easily put it in sleep mode and come back to it right away at a moment's notice. I think this is what made me love the game all the more. This isn't a new trend, and in fact DQ11 on the 3DS outsold the PS4 version in its first launch window. Nowadays, almost every Dragon Quest game is available on handheld in one way or another. While one may see the portable versions as a downgrade, that's a word that couldn't be farther from the truth for the handheld version of Dragon Quest that started it all. So join me in not judging a book by its cover, and take a chance in seeing that despite having some horrible cover art, how Dragon Quest 1 and 2 are games that are great on their own, and masterpieces for the Game Boy. Dragon Quest was released in Japan in 1986 for the Famicom to almost immediate popularity. There were a few factors to this, mainly because of its contributions by Akira Toriyama, who had already been incredibly successful with Dragon Ball in Shonen Jump. Its director, Yuji Horii, had also taken inspiration from games such as Ultima and Wizardry to cement what we generally think of when we hear the words turn-based RPG. Less than a year later, Horii's team, Chunsoft, would release Dragon Quest II. Enix would publish Dragon Quests III, 4, and 5 before remaking the first 2 games on the Famicom in 1993. 3 years, or 2 games later, Enix would release a port of Dragon Quest I and II for the Game Boy and the relatively new Game Boy Color. This was fantastic news for Game Boy fans, but it was also a bit strange that it had taken so long for a Dragon Quest adaptation on handheld. However, I think it's safe to say that Enix saw potential in creating a Game Boy RPG of their own after another series showed how well it could be done even with a black and white handheld, and how much money it could make. For us in North America, however, our pickings were a bit slimmer when it came to Dragon Quest's experiences. Dragon Quest I came to us in the US in 1989, and was heavily pushed, especially with a promotional deal for a free copy to new subscribers of Nintendo Power. Well, that's not entirely true. It was called Dragon Warrior. The impact of Dragon Warrior's release was good, but not as groundbreaking as it was in Japan. This was due to a number of factors, but I think the main culprit was with this 3-year delay in localization, many games that took inspiration from Dragon Quest were already available on the market. Titles like Phantasy Star and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. As a quick sidebar, I feel like one of the reasons people don't get Zelda 2 was because they weren't used to games like Dragon Quest yet. It wasn't just a departure from the first Zelda game, but also a departure from how games and game progression played out as well. We would see releases of Dragon Quest 2, 3, and 4, but these were not as popular and had been dethroned by another turn-based RPG. None of the games released for Super Famicom had been localized in the 90s, and so for about 8 years, the West would be without Dragon Quest. Finally, in 2000, we would see the release of Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 for the Game Boy. The original Dragon Quest is an interesting title. Being the forefather of turn-based RPGs, it wasn't without its flaws. When having discussions as to if the game should be played today, there's a usually good argument not to do so. The main reason for this is that it's very grind-heavy. It falls into a strange point where it's too basic for a seasoned JRPG player, but it's too monotonous for new players of the genre to enjoy. Dragon Quest GB finds a happy medium for both parties, and that solution is to reward players in a much quicker manner. XP and gold are distributed much more thoroughly, making progression of the game much more steady and more engaging. Yes, you have one person to control, but you also have to face off with one enemy at a time, which makes for usually very brief encounters that can be finished in under a minute. On top of this, throughout your levels, you'll learn a bevy of useful spells that will help you through your journey. The fast tracking of these elements mesh perfectly with the core loop of Dragon Quest, that being exploring and slowly and always moving up in terms of progression, while obtaining loot of some kind. While death in RPGs can punish you potentially losing the progress and reverting you back to the last save, Dragon Quest simply brings you back to the geographical start with your XP intact but your gold reduced by half. It's a great design to encourage players to spend lest they lose more currency, creating a great risk and reward while leveling. Playing Dragon Quest also feels like you're always moving forward to the end, whether you're exploring or doing a dungeon. You can always chip away at some sort of leveling if you have a handful of minutes. In other RPGs, of course, you can do the same thing, but I think it feels much more tangible again because it's a very basic game to jump into, and Dragon Quest provides such an easygoing atmosphere. When playing Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VII, even in adaptations with pausable save states, it never felt like a game one could just dip into. Not so with Dragon Quest. The Game Boy port even has a temporary save feature, allowing you to stop at any point on a dime. As the hero, your quest is generally a simple one, but it's far from mindless due to its multitude of flavored opinions from people who live in each town or castle. The game never takes itself too seriously, and just about every location has a humorous exchange, amplified even more so on the Game Boy version. Be it accidentally taking someone's treasure, to a man who dreams of puff puffs. This dialogue is also greatly improved, as the original was written in early modern English. It wasn't the worst in the world, but it's a good correction as this was a decision choice made by the localizers, and its addition doesn't really add to anything. The space in Dragon Quest is used really well with a lot of character in its world and towns. Each town has at least one humorous exchange, and one form of puzzle to be solved outside of the first town. Something that connects everything together as well is that the townspeople will include hints to solve puzzles in other parts outside in the world or other towns. From an exploration standpoint, Dragon Quest's world does an incredible job in creating an open adventure feeling. The map is not too large to be hopelessly lost, but open enough to wander and learn the geography to discover new things. Traversal on the Game Boy Edition could perhaps be the one flaw that the game does have. As the handheld has a much more limited screen space than a TV set, the game is represented in a 10 by 9 tile, meaning you might not see as far ahead as you'd like. However, I seldom ever lost my bearings while moving, and although it did bring me to some dead ends, it was either a lesson learned or an intentional design from the developers to make some of the dungeons of the game more labyrinth-like. Speaking of dungeons, although only 4, they are complex enough to challenge you, but only take up a fraction of the game. This leaves most of the exploration and combat to be done out in the open world. From a more subjective standpoint, the simplicity of the game loop without crafting components, skill allotment, or other management makes for a game that is laser focused in pacing and progression, while also proving non-linear gameplay. The risk and reward element and open nature gave a lot of freedom for my second playthrough, and I used that with my knowledge of the enemy spawns and shop prices. This let me go in a way that allowed me to bypass certain weapons in order to save for more powerful ones. Both Dragon Warrior games have points where the developers hold the door open for you to sequence break if that's your cup of tea, and this choice makes the world feel like it's filled with possibility. This is intentional, and the game will even allow you to win if you choose to not save the captured princess in the story and give you a different ending for it. By the time you finish Dragon Quest I, it's a satisfying 8 hours which never outstayed its welcome, and from RPG standards, it's quite quick. Its simplicity is what makes the game still so memorable today, but its brevity will likely leave you salivating for more. More battling, more exploring, more story, more characters. If only there was a second game attached that could just scratch that itch. It certainly would seem that Yuji Horii and team thought the same way, as Dragon Warrior 2 is everything a sequel should be, and its Game Boy port irons out almost everything that made the original not as revered. Continuing on breaking new grounds in the RPG space, Dragon Quest II had the interesting task of introducing a party system. This was almost a year before Final Fantasy or Phantasy Star, and so on its own, it would have to tutorialize to gamers of 1987 how not to just juggle one character's level, equipment, and inventory, but 3. The solution would be to start small. The protagonist hero has no magic whatsoever, so management of them is still simplified to just worrying about equipment and level stats. It's then a welcome relief upon finding the prince, who, while a bit weaker and a little bit less bulky, has the ability to heal and cast spells. This finally readies you for finding the Princess of Moonbrook, who, while certainly the weakest physically, can cast incredibly effective spells, which comes in handy when fighting incredibly strong monsters. It's a beautiful primer for a party introduction, mechanically, and on the Game Boy it only takes about 3 to 4 hours. From a story standpoint as well, Dragon Quest II marries this gradual progression with their own little side adventures. The story is quite similar at first. Hargon the Big Bad is being bigger and badder than the last game's Dragon Lord, causing havoc around the world and kingdoms that the hero from the last game established. Where the previous game had hints and riddles, each geographic area has its own unique microplot. In order to find the Prince of Kenok, you will have to go on a goose chase between his home, a cave, your home, and finally another town. For the princess, she has been transformed by Hargon, and so you will need to investigate her ruined castle and the nearby town to know where or what she is. This trend goes throughout the entire game, where every location has something interesting or has been impacted by the evil coming to the world, which paints the connectedness to the world and focuses on the threat that pervades this longer journey. The length of the adventure may feel a bit more daunting, but Dragon Warrior on the Game Boy provides an accessibility for play. The cartridge not only allows you to play on new or old hardware, but also compatibility at the time with the Super Game Boy. So while traveling, I could play on the Game Boy, and when arriving home, I could pop the cartridge into a Super Nintendo and play on the TV. It's a fantastic way of accommodating play, and is only more so complemented by the dynamic backgrounds that change based on your location in the game. In a way, it's still a novelty that we appreciate today with our modern devices, and in its origins, at least for Dragon Quest, it starts here. While playing on a Game Boy Color really shows the vibrancy of this game, I really found it endearing how nicely this game holds up even when playing on older hardware, and it's one of the reasons I decided to record this on the Super Game Boy. The size of Dragon Warrior 2 is perhaps its biggest asset, and to an extent, its biggest curse, depending on how you wish to play. Objectives are linear for the first 5 to 6 hours, but once you get a boat, the game gives you a full range of exploration, almost daring you to get lost. For those who prefer a bit more guidance, this can become an issue due to an overwhelming amount of areas and secrets to explore. This discovering aspect, I feel, is intentional. Whether or not the developers had too much faith in its players is really up to the player taste, but it feels as though this wandering and stumbling onto things is what the balance philosophy actually is. Instead of walking around a town in order to grind to the next location, that leveling and progression should be done while searching up and down the world's map. The Game Boy port even makes this action much nicer, with the addition of a bank that will store gold and items to keep inventory management less of a hassle and going out less of a risk monetarily. Some puzzles, however, I'll concede can be a bit cryptic, as some solutions are to specifically look under a vaguely hinted tile, and no thoroughness nor lunchroom gossip can guarantee that you will interact with the right one 100% of the time. Thankfully, this usually does not become a problem until near the end of the game, as even if you get stuck on one part, there's still other MacGuffins to be found around the world. I could go on about Dragon Warrior 2, but so much of its charm is about personally exploring this gargantuan place, finding warp points, keys that open secret places that recontextualize previous locales, and feeling so smart after solving a puzzle. The DNA of its improvements are found within every other JRPG, and that washes away its acclaim in the most positive forgetfulness imaginable. That's why this game needs to be experienced along with the other first entry. Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 are more than just a lovely pair in their continuation of narrative. Where one caters to a more simplistic short adventure, the other accommodates those with a longer and more complex journey wanderlust. Where one keeps its strategy simple, the other decides to ramp up its scope, both in battles and broadness. As someone who enjoys both retro and modern games, I find a bit of my patience gets lost with ones that take longer, and I can only assume that while Dragon Quest I has less going for it, it's the favored between the two because its low commitment to time. To discount its maturing into what we would see in other adventures the following year, however, cannot be understated. And zipping around in a ship with your cousins to find an opening to a continent invokes the same childlike feeling of exploring a neighborhood on your bike and finding a shortcut to the park. This is all even without mentioning the incredible soundtrack by Koichi Sugiyama. While it's perhaps cheaper and more accessible to play Dragon Quest I and 2 on their mobile phone and Switch ports, there's a bit of a dissonance between its HD sprites and Super Famicom backgrounds that the port borrows from. One of the reasons I try to prioritize playing on genuine hardware is because it gives a physical, tangible way to contextualize the realm that the game originally released in. It's far from a perfect replication, but it gives a more accurate perspective to the history of the franchise and the player at the time. The fact that I could play a game from the year 2000 on hardware of 1989 that coincidentally released the same year as the original Dragon Warrior harkens back to generations much like Dragon Quest II does to Dragon Quest I. Whether you play on Game Boy, Game Boy Color, or even Game Boy Advance, Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 is a polished and convenient way to not just experience history, but also play some of the finest games ever made. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you like what you see, make sure to hit subscribe so you can see when new uploads are released.